Well, thank you for coming, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for attending our panel discussion, Remembering the Soul in Slow Food, Exploring Histories of Racial and Environmental Justice Activism. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Foundation for all the funds they raise that allow the library to offer programming. And I'd like to thank our partners. This event is presented in partnership with the University of Oregon's Black Studies and Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies program. I'd also like to thank Melissa Bowers, who reached out to the library to organize the panel and made all the million little things happen behind the scenes. Our panel today features Bryant Terry, Isaiah Martinez, and Charise Cheney. Bryant Terry is a chef, food justice activist, and acclaimed author and publisher. He is the winner of James Beard and NAACP awards. His latest work is the groundbreaking Black Food, a beautiful exploration of Black foodways in this country and around the world. And we have Tsunami Books here that are selling copies of his book. So if you'd like to purchase a book and have it signed, that will be an option after the program. Isaiah Martinez is a chef and owner of West Indian Afro-Caribbean food truck and online business Yardy Eugene. Woo! And our moderator today is Charise Cheney, the director of the Black Studies program and an associate professor of the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. Woo. And if you want to see a whole nother talk, Bryant Terry will deliver the 2022 Peggy Pasco Lecture at the University of Oregon on May 11th at 4 p.m. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll pass it over to you.
Great discussion. I too want to thank all the people who put in effort to organizing today's panel. Julie and Melissa, thank you so much. So we're going to start off a little bit slow, and I'm going to ask you to answer the question, why the soul in slow food? Why is it important to amplify Black voices in a conversation around environmental justice, racial justice, and food justice?
Should I start? Or do you want to start?
Sure. I don't know. I'll start. So I think when I hear that question, it reminds me that we have to kind of push back against many of these terms that are used so casually and interrogate them. And I think that when people often hear slow food, they think about the food traditions from Western Europe. And a lot of this comes from, the fact that Carlo Petrini, the far left activist and organizer, really kicked this movement off, pushing back against kind of the encouragement. This is when I think it was McDonald's was hoping to open up a restaurant in Rome or something. And they're just like, no, basta, we have to push back against this. And I appreciate his radical roots and what he did to amplify this movement and really just help us to understand the contemporary ways in which we need to fight back against this concentration of power in our food system. The handful of, I think they're like over half of our food system is controlled by a handful of multinational food corporations. The issue that I take with this kind of framing of slow food and the slow food movement being closely associated with Western Europe and, kind of in the context of North America, I think people imagine it as this very affluent white movement, right? I think about the food traditions of my own family, growing up in the South, growing up in a family that had roots in the rural South, and we owned farms and very much were part of that kind of like back and forth between the city and the rural spaces that our family owned. And I think about the traditions that my grandparents brought to the city, the agrarian knowledge, the connection to the land, the desire to grow their own food. And in fact, I often talk about how my paternal grandfather, this mantra that he would often repeat to me is that if you rely on other people to feed you, when they decide that they don't want to, you'll starve. And so he very much had this very kind of self-determined lens around why we, specifically as Black people, need to be growing our food and growing our cultural foods. So, I often will start my talks with this food memory where I'm spending time in my maternal grandmother's kitchen and looking at, her cupboard that had all of her pickles and preserves and the things that she would, put up for the leaner months in the winter, and her cooking practices. And I always say that, when Margie, Medea, as we referred to her, would be spending all day Saturday making Sunday supper, that's slow food cooking. Like, the fact that she would be very intentional about taking the surplus from the summer months and the food that they would get from neighbors when they would barter and share their surplus and get things that they may not have been growing. And these traditions of putting up food, these are slow food traditions. So I part and parcel of the larger project of my, the work of my larger project over the past 20 years has been uplifting these traditions that have been a part of Black history and Black culture that I think are often erased. Even, when we talk about the food movement, this movement that is largely, kind of attributed to Northern California, popularized by the work of my mentor, Alice Waters, and what she's done to really help us put a focus on, spending in alignment with our values, supporting small farmers, eating seasonally, all these things that I think are vitally important. And she's been such an important kind of face of this movement and uplifting these practices. And once again, I think when we focus on a privileged white woman, we often erase these same type of practices that poor and working class and rural Black folks and other folks of color, when you think about people who are migrating from their home country, mother country, to the States, or even people migrating from the urban rural South and going to the North and coming out to the West Coast, these are the same type of practices that have been intrinsic to these communities. And I simply want us to expand our ideas around how we can create more healthful and just and sustainable food systems, and know that, many communities of color have had these practices, and we can learn a lot from them as well.
Isaiah?
Hello?
Oh.
It really is off. Hello? Hello?
There you go.
Oh, there you go.
Here, I'm gonna hold this too. It's gonna be hard to top that. Okay.
Maybe you could talk about how you put that into practice in your own work.
Yeah, well, I have an idea too. I think I have my own idea of how I'm gonna talk about it.
Okay.
A lot of everything you said, I connect to 100%, just to add on to that. But I would say that I started getting inspired about celebrating slow food as a person of color when I was doing research on West Indian food, West African food, and the lack of information and how challenging it was to find traditional recipes, the lack of documentation, the lack of being able to connect directly to those roots, and how easy it was to do that for European food. And so, for a while I cooked Californian cuisine, I cooked French cuisine, I cooked Italian cuisine, and a lot of it is documented really well. And a lot of our culture, West African, West Indian, African American, a lot of it is poorly documented. It's not really a focus. And so I think at that point on, I got really excited, and I was like, oh, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a part of trying to figure out where all these things come from and connect to it. And the only way you can do that is by slow cooking. You can do somewhat traditional cooking using prepared products, but it's just, you will never understand it, and you never be able to celebrate it like you would if you were doing everything from scratch using local ingredients and supporting local producers. So I would say that in the process of trying to celebrate my culture and how challenging it was to I had to buy all these books that didn't even have recipes. I had to learn about West Indian culture, West African culture and all the different cultures around African diaspora to really understand how to cook that style of food. And like, for me, that's when I was like, okay, like now I'm invigorated as a chef. Like now I have this like journey to go down where I'm like digging through the history of our people and trying to like reconnect all these pieces. And I think the interesting part is I'm in the Northwest where a lot of African ingredients do not grow here. So I get to kind of celebrate our food using ingredients that are here. So I get to kind of like be reinventive. I wouldn't call it fusion, but I would say that like, it's almost like cooking with a sensibility. So it's almost like I'm cooking like a West Indian in the Northwest. So you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's like, I can't really cook like a West Indian person because hot peppers don't do well here. they just don't, you know what I mean? And like coconut and all the other provisions that grow really well in the Caribbean, but I can cook with that sensibility and I can cook with that West Indian mind. And that's kind of a lot of what you would see at the food cart and when I do private events are like me cooking with the sensibility of a West Indian person. And I would say that the challenge for people of color is, I mean, we're lucky to have someone like Bryant. We're lucky to have someone that can represent this culture and this cuisine, and or not cuisine necessarily, but a person that can represent and be a face for people of color regarding slow food and regarding Black food. But it's just challenging because there's just not that many people out there to represent it. It's, you know, so for me, it's inspiring because I'm like, I get to be one of a handful of people that want to represent this very specific style of cooking, you know, slow food, you know. So.
And I just wanted to piggyback on something that Isaiah said, because I think he made such an important point that I'm always thinking about and underscoring the importance of this praxis, right? Because it's one thing to have this kind of intellectual understanding of what slow food might mean, but I think we need more chefs who actually are practicing making these traditional foods. And I appreciate the fact that you don't feel beholden to some kind of purity, like, oh, I have to have like Scotch bonnets and I have to have XYZ to make it authentic. But in the spirit of what I think slow food really represents is using what's on hand, using what's local, using what's seasonal, and then like looking at working with those ingredients through the lens of whatever your cooking practice is, which for you is like drawing on West and Central Africa and the Caribbean. So I just wanted to uplift the importance of chefs like Isaiah, who are my heroes, because they're actually on a daily basis practicing how to make these foods.
It's like really a great symbiotic relationship between, you know, the theory and the practice. I think that it draws attention to the you know, greatness of this panel and having you both on this panel, right? That there needs to be a documentation of these recipes, you know, that come from, you know, these histories of transatlantic slave trade, for example, or people who are, you know, there were laws against literacy, so there would not have been, you know, anybody writing down these recipes with the foodstuffs, but there's also like this improvisational, like jazz type spirit and, you know, involved too, that, you know, that makes spontaneity a necessity, right? So if we could talk about a little bit about ontologies, the origin story, starting with Bryant, for example. How did you get to this place of being a documentarian of foods from the African diaspora? Because I have known Bryant since the 1900s. So when I met Bryant in the 1900s, we were living in New York, and Bryant started off, I met Bryant when he was a graduate student at NYU in the history department. And so he evolved from that to become, obviously, 20 years in the making. This, as he said, overnight sensation, 20 years in the making. But I'm one, you know, I know the origin story here, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to this work in the first place. For example, being a transplant in New York from Memphis and seeing what foodstuffs were available for folks who were living in Brooklyn at the time.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for me to be clear about my entree into this food space was through grassroots activism. And I say that because a lot of people are just now getting to know my work through cookbooks, or maybe they see me on TV. And when I was in New York, so I was a doctoral student in history, and I knew about the Black Panther Party. I was clear that they were more than the kind of stereotypes that the popular media was painting them as, the gun-toting, rhetoric-spewing militants. I didn't know the extent to which their programming that were aimed at like improving and empowering communities. I just had no idea that they had like these over 60 survival programs. And, I was at a high school, Churchill High School today, speaking to students. And I talked about learning about their grocery giveaways where they were doing mutual aid and they were, feeding people who are living on the margins. But then when I found out about their free breakfast for children program, which was designed to feed children a hot, nourishing breakfast every morning, it helped me see the world through a different lens. First of all, I was so impressed that they had this very forward-thinking, brilliant analysis in the 60s that looked at this intersection of poverty, malnutrition, and institutional racism, and they responded to it programmatically. But then, I always talk about this moment where after this new kind of awakening or this new lens, I was looking at things differently. And I remember, very clearly this moment when I was on the subway and I saw these kids across the subway eating Red Hot Cheetos and white powdery donuts and candy. This is 7 o'clock in the morning. I was going to the village to TA a class, and they were drinking sodas and sugary juices and energy drinks. And my mentor, Raj Patel, talks about this idea of being stuffed and starved. And I was like, these young people, like they're eating what Michael Pollan calls edible food-like substances. But, these are things that are devoid in the nutrients that I think we all need, but especially young people who have, growing minds and bodies. And I was very clear that this was a problem and the work that they were doing back in the 60s was just as relevant now, right? And so this is when I started to dive deeply into food politics and understanding more. And I have to give props to Marian Nessel, the former head of the NYU Food Studies program, because her book, Food Politics, really helped me understand, I knew that it was beyond this tendency that people have, especially the right to blame the poor people for their circumstances. Well, if the people just would eat more healthfully or if they just got out and exercised more, then there wouldn't be this rise in preventable diet-related illnesses. And I knew that there were structural inequalities that, just created this reality for them where they lived in neighborhoods. I'll put it like this. When I moved from Brooklyn to the Bay Area in 2008, I lived in this neighborhood where, my apartment building downstairs, they had like a kind of one of these gentrified corner stores with lots of, organic grains and bulk items and, organic greens and whatever, and kombucha. But the type of stuff I like, admittedly, but whatever one might need to pinch. And then you walk around Lake Merritt, which is this lake adjacent to downtown Oakland. And then there was this new 8,000 square foot Whole Foods. And then you walk further around and there's a Grand Lake Farmers Market every Saturday where there's, like lots of farmers and prepared food or whatever. But if you just went 15 minutes in the opposite direction of the Whole Foods, you'd be in this community, West Oakland, California, which is where the Black Panthers were founded in the 1960s. And at that year, they did a study and found that there were 53 corner stores and liquor stores in West Oakland, and not one single supermarket. Now, I certainly don't think that supermarkets are the cornerstone of food security, but I think every community deserves a full service supermarket because the reality is that these stores are replete with processed food, packaged foods, lots of foods that are high in sugar and salt, tobacco, alcohol. And then to add injury to insult, oftentimes the prices of the products that are in these stores are double that of the same products that you find at a conventional supermarket. And so, I understood the barriers and I understood, what was the question again? I'm kind of feeling like I'm getting off track.
Origin stories.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah. So I was very clear, especially because of the communities in which these young people are coming in from, which, the interesting thing about focusing on food for the past 20 years is that the challenge for me has been helping everyone understand why we should all have a stake in creating a more healthier and just and sustainable food system. We're all missing out when corporations control our food system. And we can just talk about things like diversity. A century ago, you might be able to get 100 varieties of apples and tomatoes, and now you go to the supermarket and you only get like a small sliver. We all suffer from that. We all should be, have access to like the bounty of Mother Nature. But I was clear that the issue, like when we talk about food injustice or food apartheid or food insecurity in communities, lack of access to healthy, fresh, affordable food tends to be simply one indicator of material deprivation, right? Most often, these same communities have crumbling infrastructure, horribly underfunded and segregated public schools. They're dealing with environmental racism oftentimes, with industries that are in the communities or adjacent to them, the poison in the air and the water and the soil. So these historically marginalized communities are dealing with a range of material issues, and food being one of them. So we can't just focus on food without looking at all the issues that need to be addressed. And I think starting with food is such a powerful way. One, because so many of these issues intersect with food. And also, to fight the good fight, we need to be energized, and we need to be healthy, and we need to be strong. And I think the communities deserve an abundant and diverse food supply so that people can just live their best lives and then kind of move on beyond from there. So that's why I founded this organization, Be Healthy, because I knew as a historian, some of the most powerful social movements of the 20th century, whether we're talking about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the civil rights movement in the American South, it was young people, their brilliance, their bravery, their ability to put it all on the line and help push these movements forward. And I argued that if we want to see a successful food justice movement, we need to be empowering our young people to be in the lead of this movement.
You just reminded me of the debate that's happening right now about Whole Foods closing in South Central Los Angeles. Did you see this?
I didn't.
So they, the city created, gave them millions of dollars to build this Whole Foods in the middle of South Central, and now it's closing. And so, there's a debate over, were they really invested in the community? And then you have other people who are like, well, we need to think deeper about like accessibility, like who in South Central Los Angeles is really going to be eating at home, buying their food at Whole Foods, right? So
they should be shut down. I think that, look, I'm not going to pretend, like when I travel across the country, sometimes the first thing I'm looking for is somewhere to get like a kombucha. And oftentimes Whole Foods is the only game in town. But I'll put it like this. There is the issue of the exorbitant prices that consumers pay at these corporate-owned health food stores, or the way that they market them as health food stores is questionable if they actually are. I think there's an issue around many of the practices that these chain stores have across the country around like just racial exclusion and not making patrons of color feel comfortable, and sometimes violence against poor people of color, people living on the margins. And so I think there are many issues, but the biggest thing for me is that when we talk about food justice, it's about empowering the people who are living in historically marginalized communities. And I think about this speech that Malcolm X gave, where he was encouraging Black people to be like, contributing to local Black economies, because we know that so often when money comes into a lot of historically marginalized communities, it goes right back out because people are spending at these corporations and not supporting oftentimes a lot of independent artisans and small businesses in the community. And he said something like, at the end of the day, when you support people who don't live in your neighborhood or your community, at the end of the day, that man, as Malcolm X says, takes that bag of money back to his community. And economists talk about the multiplier effect, this idea that dollars should continue to circulate in communities a number of times before going out. And when you spend it a whole paycheck or dangerous way, I'm trying to use euphemisms not to call these stores out. But when we spend at these stores that are in our communities, okay, so sure, they're providing some jobs, they may give healthcare, but ultimately the money is going into the hands of the corporation and the shareholders. And their loyalty at the end of the day is increasing the profits for the shareholders. They care less about public health, they can care less about local communities. They're gonna do just enough to ensure that people are coming to the store and buying their products. But I think these models that we're seeing where people are creating food cooperatives and people are buying up tracts of land and thinking about ways of caring for and supporting people in communities without exchanging fiat currency. I think these are the models that are more important than feeling like we have a victory just because we have like a corporate-owned supermarket in the neighborhood, no matter how deprived the community is. And so I want to say supermarket. Supermarket is they're not in South Central. I don't know what the kind of like geographic, I don't know deeply about the geography of LA, but they're based in South LA. And they are a kind of food cooperative that was started by this Black woman. And they're empowering young people by teaching them about business, providing jobs for them. They're working with local farms and community gardens and urban farms to source ingredients. So their whole model is about serving the community, providing affordable, healthful food, training young people to be entrepreneurs and to run businesses that are going to contribute to the betterment of the community. And they are providing like really good, nutrient-rich, culturally appropriate food. And I just will finish by saying that's one of the things that I think is often missing in the conversations around what it means to eat healthfully. I think that eating our cultural foods, what were our grandparents eating? What were their parents eating? Like these foods that have sustained generations, those are the foods that we should be eating. And I'll tell you a funny example. I was brought down to Silicon Valley just last week in San Jose to present to this group, Silicon Valley at Home. You know, the tech industry has driven tremendous housing disparities and, exorbitant housing costs in the Bay Area. And so they're doing really good work in terms of taking care of the homeless population there. And I often make this, I do a demo lecture style where I'll be demonstrating a dish as well as kind of talking about contemporary health food and farming issues. And the dish that I wanted to make that day was these slow braised mustard greens, mustard, like slow braised greens being one of the kind of, cornerstones of traditional Black Southern cooking. And I was in a rush and working with the kids, getting them to school and all this, and I didn't have time to go to my local independent market that I know has mustard greens. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna get that Whole Foods down there. You think Whole Foods had mustard greens? So anyway, as Isaiah was saying, just like even like this culturally specific and important food in Black culinary traditions, it wasn't available. But stores that really understand the demographic in which they're working because they live and work in the community, they care for the community, they're going to have collards, they're going to have mustards, they're going to have, what the people are cooking with and what they think is important for them to be a part of their kind of repertoire.
Mm-hmm. So Isaiah, can you share a little bit about your origin story, particularly with Yardy Eugene? Anytime that I am in public talking with Isaiah, I love to have this conversation about how you came to be selling fried chicken as a Black man in Eugene.
Yes. This was intense to think about. But first, I'm gonna double back to like my origin story as a chef, as a Black chef, realizing that like, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to do Black food because I think for a long time I wanted to cook Italian food. I wanted to cook Californian, like market-driven food. And then it really just became like me understanding that I wanted to do Black food. And we talked about it before when I was like having such a hard time finding recipes and trying to do traditional techniques and how complicated it was to like actually find parts of history. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna do this Haitian pickles. And the first thing that would pop up is like some famous celebrity chef that's white doing pickles and like not very good, like with like just like a very a non-authentic variation of a recipe. And for me, there's a part of me that was jealous because I wanted it to be a person of color to represent that dish. And then the farther you dug, the more you realize that like Haitian people, the way they cook their food, they almost like brag about how much seasoning, to the point where I'm not talking about salt, I'm talking about how involved their hands are with the process. And it's like, it's this thing that people of color have a direct connection to. Like if you're cooking a protein, you're rinsing it with citrus juice. And not only are you rinsing it, but you're also drawing out these impurities. You're essentially cleansing the meat before you even season it. And that's seasoning, if you think about it. You're like seasoning it, and then you're seasoning it again and again and again. so for me, like there was a jealousy when other celebrity chefs that were white had these recipes like jerk chicken and peri chicken, and all these different extremely traditional recipes. Not like the jealousy part was it not being done well. Like I wasn't jealous because they were white. I was jealous because it was like, these are not done well. Like you're putting brown sugar in your jerk seasoning. That's not jerk. Like that's not the history of jerk. Like jerk is a maroon dish. Like it was the dish that basically they would, when they changed hands from the Spanish to the English, they all ran to the hills and hid they like basically would cover these pits that were smoking so that they couldn't get caught. And they would cover the pits with all the spices they found around them. So allspice bark, allspice berries, scallions, wild peppers, thyme. And so when I see these dishes and I'm like, hold up, why is there brown sugar in this? It just didn't seem right. So that's the origin story of me wanting to celebrate Black food. I would say the origin story for me with Yardy was, I was trying to pick the most iconic Black dish, in my opinion. And for me, the two most iconic, I would say, American Black dishes, in my personal opinion, is barbecue and fried chicken. So I think a lot of people think like barbecue is a white thing, it's a Black thing. It's a Black thing. Not to disappoint anyone that had their mind made up, but it's a very Black food. But we'll double back to fried chicken. I was thinking about my mentor, Sarah Kernan, who has a restaurant in Oakland, California, where she cooks skillet fried chicken, and it was amazing. It was beautiful, and the whole process of getting the chicken in, koshering it, drawing out all the impurities, piercing each piece with seasoning. Her recipe was a 4-generation recipe that came from a sugarcane plantation in Barbados, which to me was one of the most amazing things. I was just like, whoa, like it's a 4-generation recipe. And the farther it goes, the more generation that carries over, it just makes it more of a beautiful thing. But that was kind of one of the biggest inspirations. The other thing was, I was like, no one in town is really doing fried chicken good. And then I thought about it even deeper, and I was like, the last person that I thought of that did fried chicken good was Sarah in Oakland. So even when I lived in Oakland, no one was really doing fried chicken good. And then when I lived in New York, no one was really, you know what I mean? And so I was like, oh, I want to try to do fried chicken. Ironically, I'm doing fried chicken in a white populated place. So there's not that many people of color. So for me, it's like, okay, so I'm celebrating this very iconically Black food in Eugene. And I think lastly, the way I like to describe Black food in the South for a very short amount of time it was essentially this antidepressant style of food, because we were enslaved, and then we got our freedom. And we started cooking these foods that would hug you. So like mashed potatoes, gravy, like all these like very like what people think of as traditional Black food, but that wasn't traditional Black food. That was just a moment in time. And so my purpose was to basically do all these Black dishes and celebrate Black food. And there's a broad history for Black food. It's not like chitlins. It's so funny because I think people think of like 5 dishes: macaroni and cheese, collard greens, pickles, and it's just so much more to Black culture. So I actually created this model in my mind. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have a market side, and I'm gonna flex how many different Black dishes exist. And so the market side changes very frequently. I would say we have probably at least 100 variations. We've been open for, almost a year in June. And so my goal is to basically show people, everybody, people of color, but also the white people that are here, that like there is so much more to Black food. Like it's not just like collard greens and macaroni and cheese and mashed potatoes and gravy and boiled corn, whatever. It's like all these things. And so for me, that's always been the biggest inspiration for me, celebrating Black food, is trying to show people that there's so many different things happening in our culture. That said, also trying to get people of color inspired to cook at home, to cook from scratch. Because I think I'm a young guy, I'm 29. When they see me, they're like, I could probably do this. You know what I mean? Like, and that's the whole point. Like that's the whole point, is to get you to want to cook at home from scratch. If I can do it on a food cart, you can do it in your kitchen, so.
I can't. I've tried for at least 25 years to perfect that, and it's more difficult than it looks. I also love this message you have about elevating Black food. I know that you've talked about how you started off, and your desire was to, initially you were thinking about, I wanted to do Italian food, I wanted to do French food, because those are perceived to be like the most highest, most celebrated forms of cuisine, and not recognizing like the diversity and the depth and breadth of taste that occur with, certain foods that are associated with Black people. And so, this idea of elevating Black food, and it's not just, kind of a Southern African American cuisine, because you also have this diasporic side, this Trinidadian side, if you want to talk about that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, I asked myself this question, like, how do you celebrate a cuisine? Like, how exactly do you do that? Like, how do you celebrate a culture? And I think that it really takes, cuisines, I think it's a trend. I mean, I'm not saying it's a trend, but in my mind, it's a trend. Like this French or this Spanish, this Italian thing, it took one person to be like, meatballs are fancy now. Like it takes one person to really drive it. And then all of a sudden meatballs are fancy now. And it's the same thing with lasagna, and it's the same thing with all these traditional dishes. I have this joke that like a lot of these foods were peasant food. Even the European food started off as this very low thing, and then it became elevated because a king or queen saw that and was like, I really like this is the new thing, right? And so for me, with Black food, I was like, okay, how do you celebrate Black food? For one, you start by using really good ingredients, right? So that it tastes really good. And then the other thing is you kind of have to sell it to people. Like you have to like push it and be like, this is really good. For like the example for me is like fried chicken. Like how do you make it the best you can make it in a cast iron skillet using really good chicken, seasoning it really well. And for us, it's like we break down every bird. So we never buy it in parts. So it's really fresh. And so it's like going as far as we can with something really simple, where I think in people's minds, they're like, most of the time it's just fried chicken, but it's the same process with a traditional French dish like cassoulet. It's like you get a whole duck, you take all the skin off, you confit the leg, or you season the leg, you confit it, you rehydrate beans, you cook the beans, and I'm doing the same process with Black food. I'm cooking it, I get my birds as whole birds, I break them down, I season it really well, I use the carcasses as a byproduct for another dish. And so it's like, it's essentially slow food. To me, slow food is the segue to celebrating a cuisine. Unfortunately, like you were saying earlier, it really is kind of like this elitist thing, because some people can't afford to buy a whole chicken, or don't know how to break down a whole chicken, and don't have the time to process a whole chicken to feed their family. But for me, I'm like, this is the only way I can celebrate this style of food, is if I do it from scratch and from this very raw form. Like if I got my chicken in parts, that's not celebrating Black food. That's like taking the easy way out. That's taking shortcuts. For me, it's like cooking the exact way my great-great-grandmother or my great-great-great-grandmother would have cooked. It's like cooking from scratch and having that like deliberate connection to the food. The other thing, the other element in celebrating Black food is like, in my mind, it's the element of surprise. It's like giving someone something they've never had before that's really simple and blowing their mind. So it's like, for me, one of my favorite dishes, it's in the cookbook, it's a rundown dish. And so a lot of ignorant people call it a white curry. It's not a white curry, it's rundown. But you get coconut milk from fresh coconuts, and you grate it, and you make your own coconut milk, and you basically cook a bunch of provisions and a handful of seafood, and you cook them perfectly. So the timing is almost like the big, what do they call it? The crawfish boil. You have to throw things in at very certain times so that everything is cooked perfectly. And for me, like that's a dish that's iconically celebrating each and every ingredient that you're adding in that. So tonight we have salmon, rockfish, shrimp, chayote, potato, and a fortified coconut milk broth. And it's completely, it doesn't have any pork in it. It doesn't have any other animal product in it. And when you try it, you're gonna see this like marriage of like 9 or 10 different ingredients, everything being executed perfectly. To me, that's celebrating a cuisine. Like that's celebrating it. And it really takes like the person that's on the other side has to understand what's happening. Like if you're going into it, like I would say the way people look at Thai food, if you're going into it like, oh, it's Thai food, is supposed to be cheap, then of course your mind is already made up. You're like, Thai food is cheap. I'm not gonna spend money on Thai food. But to me, that's racist. Like in my mind, I'm like, why don't you want to spend more on Thai food? What if she's buying organic ingredients? What if she's making her noodles from scratch? What if she's paying her employees really well and doing all the right things? Like, to me, like the idea that like there's already a price tag on something very specific, that's the prejudice that already exists in your mind. Yeah, Chinese food, Thai food. I mean, there's a lot of things. Mexican food, yeah.
The care and time that goes into making a mole. Yeah, we see it all across the board.
There
I
was
just sound like a complaining millennial right
No,
now.
I think, well, white supremacy is insidious, right? It's in every single avenue, angle, crevice of, any industry, conversation, it is pervasive. And so the underestimation of value that comes with the preparing of these foods, the expertise that goes, it's an undervaluing of our intelligence, right, as well. And our expertise and the experiences that go into creating these dishes. And that's why you see an elevation of French food, for example, right? Okay, so to pivot really quickly before we open up the forum for questions from the audience, I want to talk about.
Well, can I just,
Yeah.
I want to segue, given something that you just mentioned.
Segue away.
I want to segue into why, so I don't know if people are aware, but this book, Black Food, is actually the flagship publication for my new publishing imprint, 4 Color Books, which is okay, see, we're like mastermind alliance. So it's a publishing imprint of Penguin Random House, and this undervaluing of Black brilliance, labor, creativity, creations, historical and contemporary. It's the main impetus behind me wanting to create this imprint. And in 2020, as we as a country, we're kind of dealing with this racial reckoning and being forced to kind of look at the ways in which we've mistreated Black people in this country. And then on the heels of that, there was a lot of revelations about racism within food media. And there were some legacy food publishing companies and some legacy food media operations that were getting called out for being racist to their employees of color, failing to promote them and take care of them. And this was a moment where I realized that, knowing history, I knew that there was going to be an intense push by those within food media to repair reputational harm. They were embarrassed, they were being called out, and I knew this was going to happen, but immediately following this, there was just the outpouring of support for Black food creatives in a way that this hadn't happened before. So you're getting a lot of people getting book deals. The book deals that they were getting were like, the numbers were higher than people would imagine getting for a first book deal. And I knew that this was going to be a moment that would pass and things would get back to normal. And this is when I told my literary agent that we need to do more than just get a book deal. We need to get some power. And we need to get this publishing imprint so that then I could be in a position to support these budding BIPOC authors and chefs and food creators and others, because we're starting with cookbooks and food related books, but we'll be publishing all types of books. And it was interesting because I was speaking at a food conference in Philly a couple of months ago. And Portia Wilson, the journalist who did the big New York Times profile of me in October of last year, we were in conversation and I talked about this idea of the door closing, and she made it clear that the door's already closed. Because she talked about her as just her experience being a seasoned food journalist who was getting like an avalanche, a waterfall of opportunities in 2020 and 2021. And she said that it slowed down to a trickle. And this is someone who's a reputable, seasoned writer. So it makes me think about, well, what about these budding writers? The people who are just trying to make their way in the industry, they're probably having an extremely hard time getting work and being able to survive. And so I think it's just the same story over and over. And it keeps me going back to this reality that it has to be about, more than just working for someone or just hitching onto someone else's ride. If these historically marginalized communities want to truly be empowered, then we need to be empowering ourselves. We need to be working to create economic stability and opportunities. And that's not to say that we can't work with outside stakeholders, whether they're investors or, whatever institutions that might be truly invested in moving power into the hands of these people. But this model where, we're just working for a job or, being further exploited under the guise of being helped by these snow-capped NGOs, those days are over. And I think people understand that it has to be about like self-determination, self-empowerment, and really, building our communities from the ground up.
So if you have not had a chance to check out Black Food yet, please do. So one of the things that we talked about earlier today at Churchill, which I think is really important to also highlight before we transition into question and answer session, is how you have created a platform for creatives. And you may look at this book as, before you actually see the book in person, you may think of it as just being this platform for documenting, Black food and Black in recipes. But ultimately, like if you look at how he has edited or curated what's in the book, he has sourced, and I didn't know this before today, local artists, local BIPOC artists, to create like artwork, which also international artists to create artwork for the book. If you have not also looked at the book yet, he has poetry, he has essayists. Each book he has done has a playlist of the musical artists that he also features. So it really is this like multi-platform celebration of Blackness in a very intersectional way too, because he's also very inclusive of, the voices of, people across the gender spectrum, and also in terms of queer identities and performances. And so, all of that is in Black Food. So,
and I think they set me up to just show some slides from the book really quickly. And I'll go quickly, but to kind of continue with Dr. Cheney's points, I wanted this book, first of all, this is a pandemic baby. We put this book together starting in 2020 in 9 months. And then, the funny thing is I used to always say jokingly, hey, this is my pandemic baby. And then my friend who's a doula was like, you put that together in 9 months. It's literally the gestation period. So this truly is my pandemic baby. And there are over 100 contributors throughout the African diaspora. And I will say that this is how much I love this guy and how much I trust him and how much I love his amazing and brilliant food. If you haven't been to Yardy, you have to go. Isaiah is the only person in this book with more than one recipe. He has 2 recipes in here because he's that good. And he's local. And he's local. He's a Eugene guy now. Oakland misses you. But so, there are the recipes, which is definitely a through line. And then I really wanted to give these different scholars and activists and creative people the opportunity to tell their stories. So their essays that talk about their different relationships with Black food and history. And then there are, just alone, like I'm going to show you. So every chapter opens with a visual art piece that I thought really encapsulates the energy and the content that follows. But even I just wanted to say that even in the food photography, we took the storytelling to a different level and just like really tried to push the boundaries of how people imagine food photography. But I'm just going to quickly go through the images and tell you, the chapter they come from. So the book starts with the prologue, the spirit, which is, in the tradition of many African cultures, just starting with the prayer, invocation of the ancestors. And so I thought it was important to start the book with that. Oh, okay. Actually, before we even go there, so let me tell you guys a quick story. So this image it was kind of our play on European still life. We called it, our team, we called it Afro still life. Nice. And so this actually was going to be the cover of the book. And I'll tell you a quick story. It has a playlist with all the recommended songs that I suggest for each chapter. And if you have Spotify, you can type in Black food and you can get the whole playlist of all the songs. So you don't have to look it up or piece it together. But, I wanted to So I sent the playlist to a number of friends. I had created it on Spotify, and I sent it to friends, and I asked them to give me feedback. And my colleague, Nicole Taylor, who actually has a book about a cookbook about Juneteenth coming out this month, she responded and said, "You know what? I love the playlist." She's in her 40s like me. And she said, "But you know, I really feel like it speaks to people of our generation, but I don't think my 20-something-year-old assistant would look at it and find music that she feels like resonates with her." And so getting that feedback, one, it pushed me to just dig deeper and really discover a lot of the contemporary music. It did, because I was like, well, let me see what the young people are doing now. And I was just so impressed by a lot of the really brilliant music that young people are making right now. And then it helped me look at this potential cover image in a different way. And I realized that I was being too, it was overly academic. I felt it was like a visual thesis statement. And I realized that I wanted a cover that would actually move people in a visceral way. I wanted a cover that if people were in a bookstore and they saw it from across the room, they were like, "Oh, I need to go look what's inside that book." And that's where we landed with this cover, which I don't know if I can say this about my book, but I will. It's kind of one of the most awesome covers that's come out in a while. And so that's just the story of that image. Then for the Spirit Prologue chapter, I worked with Maine-based artist Daniel Minter to, he was insistent, because some of the artists, I knew they were really busy and they wouldn't have time to necessarily create a original piece. And I might need to license their work if I saw something I wanted to use. And Daniel was insistent that he wanted to create an original piece for this chapter. He's an Ifa priest, I believe, and you see a lot of that imagery embedded in the image. But it was so powerful being in process or seeing his process, because he was sending me little mock-ups or just his process images. This has 50 layers in it. It started out with a very simple layer, and every time he sent it, it would just be layer on layer of images and colors and information. And so there's so much. I mean, you could stare at that image for hours, and you're gonna find more things. So the Motherland chapter. I had originally wanted to work with this young artist in South Africa, Karabo Poppy, and I loved her work and felt like it could really speak to the kind of contemporary way that a lot of African artists are creating, but we just had a hard time connecting. And so I actually, this piece is actually a huge wall within the headquarters of a friend of mine's coffee company, Red Bay Coffee. He talks about coffee being Africa's gift to the world. And they created this living wall inside of his name is Keba Kante. He's a visual artist before he became an entrepreneur. And this was this living wall that he made in the headquarters. So all that plants and grasses. And I felt like for the Motherland chapter, it just really kind of put in focus the kind of pushing back against the negative stereotypes that we often have about Africa, and depicting it as a place full of growth, abundance, and the birthplace of humanity. These are Ghanaian crate cakes. I don't know how that snuck in here, but I'm glad it did, because these will blow you away. Let me tell you. This is from an Oakland-based chef, Sam Dopes, who's Ghanaian, and yeah. Migrations. Derek Forjour is probably one of the hottest young contemporary Black artists, and we grew up together. And I saw this piece, and I knew that this was the perfect piece to open up the migration chapter and just showing the diversity and class differences and just the colorful nature of people moving throughout the diaspora. Spirituality. This is a sculpture by Oakland-based artist Dimitri Broxton. And in my role as chef in residence, I had the opportunity to work with all these brilliant curators and artists. He's actually the director of education at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, and he moonlights as a visual artist and uses cowrie shells as a big part of his practice. And I saw this, and I just knew it was a perfect piece for this chapter. The leisure and lifestyle chapter. So just to be clear, and I think Dr. Cheney spoke to this, it's the book is beyond just recipes, and it's really kind of sinking into this idea of Black leisure and pleasure as our birthright. And so Jade Purple Brown is this New York-based designer and artist. So she offered this piece of a Black woman just living her best life somewhere. I don't know, but I want to be there. I have to admit, my body and my mind are here, but my spirit is in Cabo San Lucas. We just got back from Mexico, and I don't want to be here. I want to be in the United States. I want to be here in this library right now. But
This is not rainy and cold, right? As it was
it's
yesterday.
true. For the Land Liberation and Food Justice chapter, I tapped Emory Douglas, who is the minister. He was the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party. So most images that you see that was depicted in their work, Emory created it in the 60s and 70s. And I thought this was such a powerful image, especially given they pioneered this free breakfast for children program and just really putting in the focus the importance of young people and us taking care of them and them taking care of us. This is just a food image for, I forget, the okra and shrimp purloo by, I forget who. Oh, this one. Woo-wee! These are delicioso. These are lace hoe cakes, and they're often described, they're often referred to as Johnny cakes, which, is thought to be a corruption of journey cakes because they travel well. These lace hoe cakes, the reason they're called hoe cakes is because enslaved Africans, sharecroppers, Black folks working in fields, the hoe, you could remove the metal hoe from the wood stick and you could put it over an open fire and actually cook on it. This is thought to be the original kind of like North American flat corn cakes, deeply inspired by Native people. And so it's simply corn at its simplest, it's cornmeal and water that's mixed together and cooked in some type of fat. This version was created by Charles Hunter III, a Nashville-based chef. And it has buttermilk and eggs and corn, and then he pairs it with sorghum butter over to the right. Black Women, Food and Power. As chef in residence at MOAD, the Museum of the African Diaspora, the first program that I did in 2015 was Black Women, Food and Power. And there are a few chapters in the book that are literally pulled from programming that I did at the museum, and I really wanted to kind of expound upon them in the book. And this is by Austin-based artist Deborah Roberts, who is also one of the hottest Black artists now. She does these really powerful collages, and oftentimes depicting women and really trying to highlight their strength and power. The Black Queer Food chapter is another event that I had IRL at the museum. I really wanted to give space for many of my queer and gender nonconforming LGBTQIA friends and colleagues who are working in food and often talk about the intersection of racism and homophobia and queerphobia that they deal with. And so this chapter was important to kind of highlight many of their struggles and joys. And this was an image taken by one of the contributors, Devon Francis, AKA Tuna Turner, if you're on Instagram. And he did this portrait of his mother. Radical Self-Care. This was an image by London-based artist Serena Mantle. And I've always loved her work because she does these coloring books geared towards Black women and girls. And I had bought my daughters one of her books called like Afros and Flowers, I think. And so it just had all these really cool outlines of Black women and just flowers. And she typically only depicts women in her work. And I asked her if she'd be willing to step outside her comfort zone and actually bring in the masculine divine energy as well. And she did, and she was very happy that she did, and I am too, because I love this image. This just makes me want to go and meditate, or I don't know, do some Reiki, or just, somehow take care of myself. Black Future. This is the last chapter of the book, and the kind of guiding theme, I would say the guiding kind of principle behind this book and all my work is this West African concept, Sankofa, which is about looking backwards as we move forward and bringing with us many other traditions and best practices and things that served our ancestors well with us as we move forward. One of my biggest inspirations is this chef, Edna Lewis, who's this Black chef from Virginia. And when I was in culinary school, I found that there were very few Black chefs that I could look at as role models. And I did research, found out about her and her work. And so we actually created this image, which is kind of an altar celebrating Edna Lewis's work. The portrait itself is taken by her friend, who I've become friends with over the years, John T. Hill, who most pictures that you see of Edna Lewis, he more than likely took them. He was the chair of the graduate photography program at Yale. And so I wanted to center her, and we brought in all these different elements, from coffee to cotton to, just collard greens and peanuts, these things that are emblematic of kind of the staple ingredients that you might find throughout the African diaspora. And really just thinking about her work and looking at many of the things that she did to pioneer in the food space as we move forward. And that's it.
Do we want to open it up for questions from the audience? Oh, yes.
All right, great. We'll see y'all.
No, we got it.
I guess I'll try. I just want to thank you guys for doing this. Really appreciate it. Isaiah, I had a chance to come by the food truck several times. Love it. Chef, I love your food. I have stories to tell. I'll talk to you later. But question is, I was really interested to hear Dr. Cheney. I think you used the term like this jazz spirit, right, that comes through. And I think I want to ask kind of for like a story or something. Like, when did you come to sort of conceptualize or get a stronger hold on that jazz type spirit in relation to your food? So I guess I'm asking for like a different origin story. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, I don't know, you wanna? Oh, is this specifically aimed at me or both of us? Or?
Anybody, right?
You can start.
Okay.
I like when you talk.
Well, I'll put it like this. More than chefs, more than cookbook authors, I would say my body of work is inspired by creatives outside of the food world, musicians, visual artists, performance artists. And I come from a musical family. I didn't know that. I thought you knew this, but my uncle Don Bryant was the the house songwriter from one of the seminal soul music labels in Memphis, High Records, and they were the home of Willie Mitchell and Al Green and my aunt Ann Peoples, who has her biggest hit is this song, "I Can't Stand the Rain Against My Window Pane." I don't know if you guys have heard it, but my uncle
I've heard.
look, big up to Missy Elliott because she sampled that song, and they got a lot of money for that song. But when I was growing up, it was like music, and so whenever we had gatherings, food was the center, but then there would be music because my mother and all her siblings, because my grandfather, so it comes from my grandfather who started this group in the 50s. He had a traveling gospel quartet, Eddie Bryant and the Four Stars of Harmony. They were the first Black group to perform on radio in Memphis. So all of his children were musicians, from my mom, who's like, she sings in the church choir, to my aunt who used to do jazz at clubs, to my Uncle Don, who's like, a big star. In fact, I just want to give up props to my Uncle Don because his career as an artist took a backseat to Ann's when they got married. She was the big star, and he was writing for her. So he did a secular album in 1964, and then in the 80s, he was doing some gospel music. But at the age of 75 in 2017, he put out his second secular music album. 2 years later, he put out his third, and he got a Grammy nomination for Best Traditional Blues Album at 77 years old.
Wow.
And so we're super proud of him for that. And he's always been an inspiration. But, I collect classic jazz, and just this whole idea of working within a structure and just kind of like playing within the structure and allowing spontaneity and creativity to just in the spirit, just to drive the music. It's so there are a couple things. One, and I hope I don't run myself out of business with this, but I know, and we talked about this earlier, a lot of people just haven't been cooking. Thankfully, over the past 2 years, more people have been like practicing cooking because out of necessity. But I really seen cooking and cookbook writing as a cornerstone of my activism because I want people to feel empowered to make food at home. And I always say that recipes are a guide, you know, in the spirit of what Isaiah's been talking about. Yeah, if you have a recipe that calls for mustard greens, and you're growing Swiss chard, don't go out and get mustard greens. Use the Swiss chard in your yard that you're growing. And also just like, I know a lot of people who are novices in the kitchen, they get freaked out if you say like a handful or a pinch. They're like, what do you mean? I need exact measurements. Don't do this to me. But I think that sometimes, I mean, I don't remember my grandmother with whom I spent so much time in the kitchen ever using a measuring cup or a measuring spoon. It was all by like intuition and feel and grabbing a handful of this and a cup of this and a pinch of this. And I think that should be the ultimate goal. And so I always go back to this idea of a jazz as a metaphor for my approach to cooking, where it's about drawing on like tradition, but then working within that tradition and structure and just seeing what kind of like magic happens from there.
Okay, I like, you actually said something that made me think of what, like, that like Ratatouille moment where like music starts playing in my head. And it's normally when I can like cook a recipe without a recipe. It's like normally where like a good example is like we make a lot of like what do they call it? Quick breads through my business. We don't buy any bread ever. We make all the bread from scratch. Sometimes people kind of like get it twisted. We always make it. But it's like learning like for me, it's like I've never settled at something being complete. So I think that one thing is if you come to the cart, you'll see the cornbread change over time because it's like I'm trying to find like what ratio of 3 different corn. All the corn we use is 100% local and organic, but we have 3 different kinds. So we have organic Bob's cornmeal, which is essentially flour, and then we have a more coarse corn, which is Abenaki, which is like an actual indigenous native corn to Oregon. And then we have this Italian variety heirloom corn that we get from Camas. So it's all grown here. And so for me, it's like I'm always playing with the ratio of moisture and I'm always playing with the ratio of salt to sugar to try to find that perfect balance. And I'm essentially trying to make cornbread that reminds me of New York. Because being a kid in New York, how you would go to a bodega and you would get like a cheesecake muffin. In New York, there were always corn muffins. They were never vanilla pound cakes and all this stuff that you see now. It was always a corn muffin. And I mean, New York right now still has that. Like you can go to the store and always get a corn muffin. And I'm not saying it's good for you. It's definitely one of those things. It's definitely one of those things you probably shouldn't eat. But as a kid, it was like, that was like my thing. I love corn muffins. I would say that like, the music starts playing when I can figure out how to cook a dish without a recipe, and then trying to figure out how to share that with someone else. So I cook a lot. I cook for a lot of farmers. So farmers come to the cart frequently. They'll drop off ingredients and then get doubles or get fried chicken. And if they're super inspired by something, they're the first person I'll give a recipe to because I know they're going to cook it at home. And I always tell them my number 1 rule is that they can't change the recipe. Like you can look at the recipe as a guideline, but you can't change it. Like you need to do it exactly the way that it's like not like the chard example, but I'm saying like don't change the amount of teaspoons. Don't like leave it the way it is. Look at it and then make the recipe. And creating that connection with someone and also like sharing the history. You know, like being able to extend that because a big part of history is sharing it. Like if you're the only one that knows how to make something, if you figured something out and you don't want to share it, that's like the challenging part of celebrating it. No one else can make it if you don't share it. And so for me, it's like, I have all my recipes in an Excel document right now, every single one. And I'm at the point now where I look at it and I'm like, okay, I remember how to do this. Okay, I remember how to, and I'll always look at it. And every now and then I'll change little elements of it. And if a friend is like, this is amazing. If you've been to my cart and you're amazed by something, I will send you the recipe. It's 100% fact. And I've done it multiple times, but my number 1 rule is like, don't change it and be like, this is Mark's jerk chicken. Don't do that. It's gonna stress me out. It's gonna stress me out. It's gonna trigger me. It's gonna trigger my millennial brain. I'm gonna be like, what are you doing? Like that's what stresses me out about the jerk chicken that, I'm not gonna start naming celebrity chefs because this is being recorded, but there's so many. There's so many, you know what I'm talking about. And it's like they got excited from a traditional recipe or from going on vacation and someone making something amazing. And then they go in the lab and they're like, I'm going to make this better. And it's like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
You're not going to make that better. That's generations of trial and error.
Now we're back to white supremacy.
Yeah.
I can do it better.
Yeah.
You guys watch the show Atlanta
Oh.
on FX?
Yeah.
Does anybody watch the show? Okay. So I'm gonna give away just this one season, just which encapsulates exactly what we're talking about. There's a character on there. He's from the States, but they were in Europe because his friend was a touring artist. And he was asked at this meeting, they were at this fashion house, well, what do you want to eat? And he said, jollof rice. And they were like, oh, the woman who was like the kind of concierge at the company was like, oh, my husband and I, we know all the Michelin restaurants in London, but we've never heard of jollof rice. And so he takes her to this restaurant in this Nigerian neighborhood. And it was a traditional Nigerian restaurant run by this Nigerian woman. And they have this amazing meal. And, you know, he's having a conversation with the woman. And she's like, are you Nigerian? He's like, no, she said, are you Niger? And he's like, yeah, I'm Niger. And talked about where he's from. And then the white woman he was with at lunch, she's like, well, what does Niger mean? He's like, oh, that means Nigeria. You know, we're in a Nigerian restaurant, eating Nigerian food, listening to Nigerian music. Anyway, fast forward to the end of the episode, he comes back to the restaurant to eat and he notices that it's closed. And then he looks across in front of the restaurant and the woman who he brought to the restaurant with him has a food truck called Niger Bowl. And so they bought the restaurant from the landlord, displaced this woman. She didn't have like a new plan or new restaurant. She was just like without the woman who owns the restaurant. And then they totally like corrupted the food by making it all like she was like, the guy's name is Darius and he's from Atlanta. And she's like, here, I want you to try this. And he's like, what is this? And she's like, oh, it's jollof rice with peach reduction and pieces of goat. And I call it the Darius because you're from Georgia. And so I just feel like that whole episode so brilliantly kind of speaks to the way in which so often creators, people who come from cultures and make the food that we all love and we all want to eat, oftentimes they have very little resource to capital to start to buy brick and mortars or rent brick and mortars to get business off the ground. And then even within the publishing world, like so often they don't have access to get into the publishing world and publish their books. And then you have white chefs and cookbook authors who, you know, don't come from that culture. And, you know, even the ones who may have like lived in like Thailand for a couple of years, but then all of a sudden they become the face of this cuisine. They get the investments to open the restaurant. They get the 6-figure book deals. And this is the kind of insidious and maybe not so insidious problem that we're speaking about, where you just have like these Black folks and other folks of color who are having their traditions exploited and they aren't getting compensated or even like acknowledged oftentimes for being the creators of these cultures and cuisines and foodways. So
TikTok.
Yeah.
Done a wonderful job in talking about the history and anthropology.
This is Yvette Alex Ascenso, who, by the way, is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion on campus.
oh, okay.
Dr. Ascenso.
So I've enjoyed really hearing about history. And I'm wondering what's next. So what's next for you? What's next for Yardy? How can we help support it?
Oh, okay. I think for me the next step. I mean, I want to write a cookbook too, but the next step is to try to.
Stop giving your recipes away, man.
No, the cookbook would be like the cookbook would have a more emotional connection. But I would say that like I don't know because I'm in a food cart. But I would say the next step is trying to figure out a way to celebrate Black food on a larger scale, whether that be a brick and mortar, whether that be like a catering company that does private dining experiences. I mean, I've been doing that now. I've already been doing private caterings where it's like our average check is like 150 a person. And it's like we only sell 25 or 30 tickets. And it's like a more private dining experience where like I come out, talk to everyone about every dish. And so for me, it's like the goal is to it's hard to celebrate cuisine in a food cart. It's more challenging, I would say, but when you have the right setting, like if it's a brick and mortar, it's like so much easier to celebrate a culture because there's just, you can set the vibe with music, you can give really good service, or you could put it on a really beautiful plate. You can change it frequently. There's just so many different ways to really dress it up and make it really nice. And I would say that the farther down the line, it's like in my business plan, is to promote and to, like you were talking about earlier, Bryant, is to promote and work with marginalized people. So find young people that would have less of an opportunity and like employ them, make them sous chefs, make them CDCs, like have this like platform where like they're not working at a French or an Italian restaurant, but they're working with me, and they have this opportunity where they can go anywhere because they worked with me. And that's kind of, I'm sure that statement has bravado, but I think that I have the skill set in the bag to like drive young people to be successful as a chef. And that was always my drive, was to be so good that at some point I could pass on those tools so that other young marginalized people could be successful.
Well, a couple things. One, I really want to learn how to be a good publisher. Like, I know about publishing and the internal logic of that world, and from the talent standpoint, because I've been a publisher, I have 6 books. But in terms of being a publisher, I'm figuring it out, and I love being in this position of discomfort. I am learning a lot, and we've acquired 4 books. We're on the cusp of acquiring a couple more. Actually, 2 of them are coming out next year. One by Isaiah Martinez, this 17-year-old chef in Oakland who has cooked at the James Beard House and has staged at Chez Panisse. She's actually working at Chez Panisse now on the line. Ecoy in London and other places. She'll be starting college at Cornell in the fall. So we're publishing her book, Flavor Plus Us, Flavorous. And then we are, actually the second book we acquired was an art book by this Brooklyn-based photographer, Adrian Burrill. His book, Black Yearbook, will be coming out next year. And in the fall of last year, he did a tour of North America, and he traveled to educational institutions throughout North America, from Ivy Leagues to trade schools. And he talked to Black people on campus, students, provosts, administrators, staff, and just what Black life looks like in the 21st century. And he documented it through photos. So it'll be like the photos coupled with their interviews. So I'm excited about the work as a publisher, but in terms of my personal practice, I really, the next focus is going to be moving this body of work that I've created over the past 20 years into the contemporary art space. So next year, I'm actually going to be visiting scholar / resident artist at the Black Studies Department at UC Berkeley for the next academic year. And I'll have an art studio, and I'm going to be working with artists to really help. I'm not going to say too much about it. I want to jinx it, but I'm just going to leave it at moving my body of work into the contemporary art world. And then the last thing is just like being a good dad and being around more. I feel like the struggle in the early years is I was just really struggling trying to like get my career off the ground, which meant a lot of traveling and a lot of just busyness. And I really want to create space in this next period to just be present with my 2 daughters and my wife, and to be at home more as I'm getting ready to travel to 5 more cities in the next couple of weeks. But,
Including
next year, including Milan and London.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I know that, we're coming back into public, so I really appreciate you taking that step forward, and I really, really appreciate the insights and contributions and conversations that you 2 have had today. They're very enlightening and inspiring, and and there will be more tomorrow on campus at the EMU Redwood Room at 4:30 if you guys want to continue to have this conversation with Bryant. So thank you all for coming out today. Appreciate it.
I'll be signing books over here if you have books that
Yes.
you would like signed.
Get your book signed.
I need to get my book signed tomorrow.
Get your book and get it signed. Get 4 books and get all